Welcome to the Delling Pod, as I believe it is called now. And you are all going to be so amazingly ill at his appearance. It is none other than Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad, or Akkad, as I believe. You don't even know how to pronounce it, do you?
No, I have no idea.
Was it just a name you picked out of the books and you thought, aye?
It was just my favourite historical figure, and I used him as an alias when I was, in the early 2000s, you didn't really use your own name, you used an alias, because nobody really took the internet very seriously.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a holdover from when I was, not a teenager, but in my early 20s. And I just used it for every site that I'd signed up for, nothing.
I hadn't even heard of him until you started using his moniker. So tell me about him.
Oh, he was the first ruler that we can legitimately call an emperor, I think. He ruled over a large swathe of the Middle East along the Fertile Crescent around 2250 BC, around that sort of time. He was Semitic, not Sumerian, which is a different ethnic group. And he, I guess most importantly, and I think interestingly, he's the origin of the Moses birth story, in the reed basket passed down the river. That was his story well over 1,000 years, of probably 2,000 years before Moses.
So he was in the basket, or he was Pharaoh?
He was in the basket.
No.
Yes. And he was pushed down the Tigris or Euphrates, I can't remember which river, and picked up by a gardener called Aki, who adopted him as a baby, obviously, and raised him to be a gardener in the king's gardens. And eventually, and we don't know how this happened, because the parts of the legend that would normally tell us were broken up, so it's a lacuna. But somehow, Sargon goes from being a gardener to being the king of Kish. And from that point onwards, he starts conquering. And soon he's a legend.
So you've got this blend of myth and reality, isn't you? Because you think about all the... It's quite a common trope, isn't it, in literature, where you've got the ordinary... You think of Joseph, for example, the ordinary person who suddenly becomes very, very powerful by mysterious means, or the boy who pulls the sword from the stone and becomes Arthur, or Harry Potter, or The Matrix.
Yeah, he's
that for real?
He's a one. Well, I mean, probably not.
No.
I mean, the age of the character makes him essentially mythological. Anything that we know about him or think we know about him is going to be very dubious.
Was he a goodie?
Well, if you're on his side.
Oh, I see. Right. So he was a despot.
Well, all of them were.
Yeah.
I mean, civics wasn't exactly something they taught in school back then. So the very concept of the state itself was kind of new, and it wasn't very advanced, and it was obviously imbued with many religious dimensions and things like this. So his rise to power was often intertwined with the goddess Inanna and her favour of him, which is how they explained everything, really.
You probably have done more to revive the reputation of Sargon of Akkad than any erudite scholar of...
Well, there is a remarkable
times.
amount of art of Sargon on the internet now, which is good.
Is there? And is there any in the British Museum?
Not of Sargon himself, because of the age of the figure. It's just there's very little on him, but there's a huge amount of Assyrian work in the British Museum, which is amazing.
Yes, no, I love the Assyrian galleries, and it makes me feel really proud that we retrieved this stuff from the Middle East, where it would otherwise have been probably blown up by ISIS by now.
Yes.
Yeah. So, tell me, did you ever have a phase of your life when you had a proper job?
Oh, many.
What have you done before you became the thing you are today?
I mean, before I went to university, I would. This was before minimum wage.
Yeah.
I would be a kitchen porter and cleaner for like £3.25 an hour.
So that's George Orwell territory.
Kind of, yeah. And then I went to university. I did a computer science degree. I hated it.
But you can do computery stuff.
Well, I could at the time.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah, but it's so boring.
So boring. Actually, had you pursued it, I bet you'd be earning shitloads, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, but I was never really that interested in money. I was more interested in doing something I found engaging.
Right. So you were quite early on to this whole shit posting, edgelording.
Back when, I remember effectively, I've lived through the invention of the popular internet. So back when I first started, I was on a 486, and we had We actually started with a 28.8 K modem, which was amazing for the time, and I could actually play a multiplayer game of Doom with my friends using the telephone lines. It was quite incredible, and back then, when trolling first started becoming a thing, it wasn't what people think trolling is now. It was a lot more cerebral back then. In fact, it was about the whole trolling is an art thing. It was about setting up a framework that the person would deliberately bite, and so they would get themselves worked up over nothing. It wasn't about trying to hurt people.
Well, that sounds a bit like Twitter. When Twitter's good, isn't it about the bans?
Yeah, exactly. When Twitter's good, it's about the bans. But Twitter now is just venomous, I find.
I agree, but I think it is still possible for those of us who value the sort of wordplay and sparring. It's still possible for us to use Twitter for good rather than evil.
I agree. It is possible.
But not common.
No.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about the thing for which you are currently most famous.
Oh, God.
Unfortunately. Which is being chucked off Patreon.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd never thought... let me apologise, by the way. In a recent article in The Spectator, I described you as left libertarian, and I got taken to task in a rather pernickety way, I thought, by a few of your fans saying, "No, he's not left libertarian. If you saw the recent recent thing he did, you'll find he's in the centre." And I said, yeah, does it really matter? But anyway, I'm sorry for calling you left libertarian.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I when I was in my 20s, I read something like 2/3 of Capital. I found myself a bit more socialist-y than I realised, and as I came into my 30s and became more politically engaged, I started being a bit more critical about things I'd read, and realised that no, I'm a liberal, I'm not a socialist, and I was very much centre-left, and in many ways I still am. I mean, I don't think my political opinions have changed all that much, but I'm very committed to a sort of libertarian centrist worldview.
Yeah. I don't think there are many of us on our side of the argument who didn't go through a left-wing phase. I'm just trying to think. Probably Charles Moore and Douglas Murray, I suspect, didn't. I never did, but that's because I'm really clever. I never.
I'm modest.
I never sold out to the stupid. I just, and I was also lucky when I was at university, which is traditionally when you go through your stupid lefty phase. We had Margaret Thatcher doing the Lord's work, and so one didn't really need to fight political battles. It was all kind of...
Well, this all comes down to the way that the left has been fighting the political battle, because one of the Conservatives are frankly terrible at fighting the culture war, which is why they're losing, and they're going to keep losing, and it's disappointing to watch Conservatives kind of recoil in horror at the idea of coming and having a conversation with me. Because, I mean, none of my opinions are particularly outrageous. I'm just okay with having fun on the internet. And to a lot of people, this seems highly controversial and boundary breaking.
But who are these lots of people? Because isn't it just the kind of SJWs?
Well, no, the people... No. I mean, obviously, they despise me because I oppose their ideology root and branch. But the sort of stodgy establishment conservative... is watching the sand shift under their feet at the moment, and they don't really understand what's going on. And I can help them with that, but they are too proud, I would say, in many ways.
Yeah. We have been talking about this in the pub, not over a drink, because neither you or I like drinking before podcasts. And also we've talked about it a bit on the separate vidcasts that we recorded before this, and I really like the idea of doing a kind of a double thing where if you like one half, go and find yours will have how many listeners have you got? Viewers?
About 900,000 subscribers.
You've got 900,000. I think I've got about 900. So that's fair, isn't it?
I think that's
so. So we can do a bit of cross pollination, but I think what you say there is the subject for so many podcasts. In fact, pretty much every podcast I've ever done, ultimately the question underlying it is, how do we on the right win the culture wars when at the moment the left's all over us, really?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a centrist, so I like a good balance between both. Preferably, I would like. The main problem is the kind of, I don't know how to put it, like the basic axioms of left wing and right wing thought are different, obviously, and the concerns of each one. For example, the left don't really believe in personal agency, but the right don't really believe in the effective structure and order, and so you can never really have a conversation with someone that finds comprehensive solutions from one side or the other in their extremity, or at least on their own. It's never that simple. And this is something that I find the Conservatives, like, for example, the Conservatives will argue, oh, well, okay, we need, completely minimal state, we need absolutely zero state interference. And what you do there is you open up the grounds for the lefties, the Labour socialists, to turn around and say, these people don't care about you at all, and so they're going to do nothing for you. And so now what do you do?
Yes, but that's more a failure of argument than a failure of ideology. I mean, if you... My God is Thomas Sowell,
yeah, of course,
for example. And if you ever want to know why the minimum wage is a bad thing, you just consult Thomas Sowell,
yeah,
who explains in both from his personal life experience and in economic terms why it actually doesn't benefit the poor.
And a very intelligent person will read that and come away convinced.
Yeah,
but most Labour voters are not.
No, I agree with that, because
it's easy to appeal to people's baser states, especially if they're not highly educated people, and it's not just that though. I mean, this is kind of getting off into the weeds of what I really want to talk about, because it's about engaging with people, right? Because the Conservative, like the impression that the Conservative give, is of being lofty and self-important and educated, aristocratic, and these are not bad things, but these are also the diametric opposite of the way that the Labour Party try and convince people of them. I mean, for example, Jeremy Corbyn's been in Parliament since, the 80s, the early 80s? Yeah. When was the last job he had? And yet he's parading around as if he isn't worth a large amount of money, and saying that he's the friend of the working man. He doesn't know anything about the working man, which is why Labour can't understand why people are voting UKIP or Tory in the North now.
Yeah.
They just have no idea. But it's the fact that the Conservatives leave this ground open.
But again, you're talking about tactics, not the ideology itself. I mean,
well, it comes from the ideology. The kind of tactics that you use are born from the ideology itself, because you set out a system of boundaries to be able to even decide and define your ideology. And necessarily, you're going to include some things and exclude other things. And the things that the Conservatives are excluding are, honestly, fertile ground for Labour. And so I don't think that being all one or all the other is very wise, because all you're doing is effectively leaving an open field for the enemy.
But do you think, and I notice we've strayed far from the original question, which we'll come back to, the Patreon thing, but do you think that the solution to that is for the Conservatives or whoever, the people roughly on our side of the argument, to water down their ideology and actually abandon their belief that minimal government is a good thing? Or do you think it's simply a question of PR and explanation? And
I don't think it's either. I think it's a case of learning when to compromise and learning when to be firm on your principles. So it's very easy to say, I disagree with social healthcare because I'm a principled Conservative and I want to have absolutely minimal government interference. But that doesn't in any way persuade anyone who is poor and needs government assistance for healthcare. And so the Conservatives might well believe this, and I don't say that it's right or wrong that they do, but they do have to accept the reality that this is not appealing to large segments of the population. And now I don't suggest that you go the complete other way and become Theresa May capitulating to Labour's every demand. I mean, you do not abandon your principles, but you have to learn when to compromise. And I think that there are certain subjects like that on which the Conservatives really need to learn how to compromise.
Well, you say that, but actually earlier today we were bemoaning the fact that the Conservatives don't stand for anything conservative.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? Because when I say you should compromise, what I mean is you've got a set of certain principles that you hold to be conservative ideals, and being people who are sensible, pragmatic, you live in the real world. You understand that you never no one ideology. Like it's the same with a socialist. I would say exactly the same thing to a socialist. You know, they would say, "Well, I've got these socialist ideals, and I want to see them realized perfectly." Okay, but most of the world doesn't, and you now have to engage in a dialogue with your political opposites, let's say conservatives, and you need to find a reasonable middle ground on which you can both find an acceptable compromise, because ultimately, politics isn't about the talking heads realising their political ambitions and ideals for their own moral satisfaction. It's about helping people. You know, so when you say I'm going to sit there and I'm standing on this point of principle, well, sometimes it is really appropriate to stand on the point of principle, and we can get into how the Conservative Party have failed to do that. But the question is not, do you abandon your principles? The question is, when do you understand that you're never going to reach the exact expression of them that you want?
Yes.
You know, taking a realistic.
I have to say, you're sounding dangerously like a politician.
I don't consider myself a politician.
No, I'm sure you wouldn't, but you are actually sounding a bit like. Look, before we develop that, maybe we don't want to develop that one, but the Patreon.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, why did they? What was the reason given for getting rid of it?
It's because context no longer matters. What matters is there are certain dog whistle words that bring out the rabid lefty pressure groups. And there are many of these, and they operate very openly on Twitter, where they just say, we actively want to deplatform and defund various, and I mean, I wouldn't even just say conservative now at this point, it's just various dissident voices who go against their very far left narratives. And if you're one of them, and I mean, for example, I got in trouble for calling Nazis the N-word. Now,
did you?
Yes.
With whom?
With Patreon. That was the reason. So I.
Oh, sorry. I see what you mean. Yes,
Yeah.
No, I understand.
Yeah,
Yes, okay,
So I basically. There are very unsavory types on the internet. And I don't really like talking about them, because if I talk about this, then it gives them life. Then they'll go to some, you know, opaque message board somewhere and talk about how, Sargon talked about this us on James Delingpole or whatever. And so I don't really like, you know, breathing any life into it, but unfortunately I have to talk about it because it's part of the story. But basically they view me as a gatekeeper in a way. They think that I obviously should become a Nazi, and the fact that I'm not becoming a Nazi means that I'm effectively holding my audience hostage away from them, because they feel like they're entitled to my audience or something like that.
Yeah.
And and so they'll go out of the way to harass me and my family and things like this. And I obviously try to kind of keep it on the down low. But it was getting quite stressful. This was about 10 months ago. It's all over now, so I'm not worried about it now. But it was getting quite stressful. And I just wanted to lash out at them, frankly. And I was on a podcast of a YouTuber with something like 4,000 subscribers. It's a very small channel.
Yeah.
Very obscure. You know, I hadn't told any of my patrons or anything, so they wouldn't have known. But the alt-right were there, you know, in the chat spamming. I was like, you know what? I'll insult them and tell them that they act in the same way that they consider black people to act.
Right. So yes, you were looking for the ultimate insult to a white supremacist, which is accusing them of behaving like their concept of black people.
Exactly, the way they demonize black people.
Yeah.
And obviously that's not an opinion I hold, but it doesn't matter that that's the context.
It really doesn't matter, because I was having a conversation the other day with somebody very much on our side of the argument, internet savvy and stuff, and this person said to me, "Yeah, you want to be careful with that, Sargon of Akkad. Do you hear what he actually said?" And I was thinking, well, yeah, I did, and yeah, context.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how effective that strategy is if you want to deplatform somebody.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, this kind of brings us back to what I was trying to say with the Conservatives. I'm all for compromise, but it must be done from your own principled position, as in you know where your principles are and how far you're prepared to compromise on them. And as an outsider watching the Conservatives and Labour, I'm a member of UKIP for anyone who doesn't know, watching the Conservatives and Labour having a dialogue, I honestly don't see much difference between I guess you call them the wet Tories,
yes,
and Labour. It seems that the Conservatives themselves, they're not just compromising. They seem to have embraced the principles of the Labour Party and are in fact in some sort of competition with the Labour Party to push these principles even further. Yeah. For example, censorship of pornography. It's not a very classically liberal thing that they should be conserving censorship. And hate speech laws. Sajid Javid saying that he wanted to expand them to include misogyny and ageism. And I'm just sat there pulling out my hair thinking, you've been in government since, 2010? You guys should have repealed these like a decade ago. Yeah. There should be no hate speech laws. You know, we're the country who invented freedom of speech. Shouldn't you try and conserve that? But instead, they're pandering to Labour because they don't seem to have any moral base with which to resist Jeremy Corbyn's moral attacks. And that's all he does, is moral attacks at the Conservatives. And instead of doing something like I can't believe that I'm rooting for Margaret Thatcher at this point to come back and retake the Labour Party. But I mean, whatever you thought about Margaret Thatcher, at least she had a moral grounding for what she was saying. She would take a very high-minded, very, very British approach to what is right and wrong, and she was very firm on this. And my goodness, it's something I really miss from political dialogue now, from the Conservatives. Because, I mean, all I see is Theresa May promising 20 extra trillion or however much it is for the NHS. And I'm just thinking, or you could do the sensible thing and stop mass immigration. And then you don't have to continue to throw billions after billions after billions at an ever-expanding NHS that is essentially going to be unstable and unprofitable, and not unprofitable, untenable. But for some reason they won't. But she's following the Labour line of reasoning, and she can't get off of it because she's already implicitly agreed to its premises, and now she has to follow it on.
It's very hard to find an issue, actually, where the Conservatives haven't sold the path to the left.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that the Conservatives used to be famous for was having a strong defence.
Yeah.
And yet they've run down our military so that we can no longer operate in many theatres. We're not a credible force anymore.
Not even slightly. And one of the main problems with the Conservatives is their abandonment of national pride. I mean, that used to be they were the bulwark. I mean, again, you listen to Margaret Thatcher in the 80s speak about being British. My God, it makes you want to stand up straighter, and pronounce your T's correctly. It is an ideal that was held up by the Conservatives as a moral good to be British, and now they're ashamed to say it in public.
I tell you what really, really puzzles me is you look at what, for example, Bolsonaro did in Brazil. And in fact, Bolsonaro really is the Trump of the tropics, I think, in the way that he approached that campaign. And he was accused, for example, of abusing somebody in Parliament using sexist language when he said, "I wouldn't even rape you" or something like that.
He's got my vote.
But the thing was, when you looked at the context of that remark, it was perfectly justifiable that she had, context again, isn't it? She had said something really vile to him, and he was just responding in kind. But he didn't back down. He didn't apologise. He said, "This is who I am. Vote for me, or don't." Or don't. How is it that our Conservatives haven't learned the lesson from Trump, from Bolsonaro, from Viktor Orban? We're never going to be like, we're not Hungarians, we're not Brazilians, we're not Americans. But the lesson surely is authenticity, honesty, ideological integrity are what people want.
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that you notice is Nigel Farage should essentially be leading the Conservative Party.
Yes.
He's what I would consider to be a classic Conservative, and I mean in a very positive way.
Yes,
someone who isn't a Conservative but can see the strengths of being a Conservative. But then, 20 years ago, I would have been able to make the same sort of case for Labour. There are strengths in being, part of a movement who are concerned about the struggles of the working class, because there's no doubt that they have them and they need representation. But it's all changed now, and yes, like the Conservative Party obviously wouldn't have someone as fiery as Bolsonaro, but they could still have a very well-mannered, well-spoken, very British, and called Jacob. Yeah. I mean, in fact, it's actually wildly frustrating as someone outside of the Conservative Party to watch how they're afraid, the establishment of the Conservative Party is obviously terrified of Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they have every reason to be, because, I mean, cometh the man, cometh the hour. We are currently we're at a time, Britain as a country is at a point where the Conservatives have failed to embody Britishness. And they've just failed. Because the Labour parties and the left in general, the sort of globalist left, and I suppose the globalist right in this case as well, have successfully undermined the concept of national values and the sort of national identity. And the left's entire weapon is attacking your identity. So it's no surprise that the Conservatives, not really being conversant in this kind of ideology and not understanding the angles and vectors at which it attacks you, and having no real good defence of their own because they've never taken the time to formulate one, have just collapsed completely to these attacks. And so now Theresa May is offering up billions to the NHS. She's opened the borders. They think hate speech laws are a great thing. And I'm sat here thinking, okay, revolution.
Yes, I think that's a very good analysis, that they have bought into the terms defined for them by the left, which are actually the terms of a probably 10% of the country maybe thinks,
if that.
If that. And yet, because they're so visible on Twitter and through Change.org campaigns and stuff, they've created a climate in which every female MP pretty much is desperate to show that what really matters to her is the gender pay gap. How
It's unbelievable.
How can the Conservatives?
I know.
Whatever else the Conservatives should stand for, it should be empiricism. We know that the left is all about the narrative, about my feelings. The right is always about unpalatable truths, the facts, whatever. So if you're talking about unpalatable truths or just truths, the gender pay gap does not exist.
It's even worse than that. And this is, when I say worse, I should say better. Well, it's even worse for the left on the narrative of the gender pay gap. It's not that there isn't one. There is one, and it's justified. And every single Conservative who wants to earn the name needs to say that proudly and loudly and confidently and back one another up, regardless of who it is saying it. The gender pay gap is just. This is how it should be. Women work less hours in easier jobs and less danger and all this. There are all these other factors that mean that, honestly, it's amazing that women earn as much as they do, given how much more effort and time and danger that men put into their jobs.
Can you think of any Conservative MP who would go on a public platform?
They will all go out and condemn me for this.
Say that.
They will all condemn me for saying that.
And but here's the other problem. If anyone did go on a platform and say that, all it would need is somebody at the BBC or The Guardian to say, this is what he said. Yeah. They wouldn't even need to dress it up. They'd just say, this is what he said, and it would be have you pronounced
it would be lynch
re?
mob. Lynch mob. We need to take this guy's job. We need to... And the Conservatives, like I said, they have no moral spine. They have no moral fortitude whatsoever anymore. And so instead of listening to what the person says, say, right, okay, women earn less and therefore... women work less and therefore they should earn less. And there is no formulation of this where you can say... Men work something like 44 hours a week on average. Women work something like 37 hours a week on average. The idea that could ever equal out would require women to be privileged. For women to work fewer hours than men and earn the same amount of money must necessarily require female privilege and a deliberate weighting of the scales in their favour. The fact that that's not the case and they're about 15% down with about 15% hours down means that we're working in quite a fair system and no one can actually identify any of the sexism in the system. Point to the people. They're filled with actors. Point to the hiring. That person is a sexist. Point to the pay. And this was most exemplified by the BBC's gender pay gap scandal with Carrie Gracie. She's there working something like 5 hours a day in China, and she's comparing her wage to the chap who works 10 hours a day in Washington and wondering why she earns half as much as him. And it's like, well, I'm not a mathematician or anything, but it seems to work out fairly easily on paper, and you could tell that she knew she was getting away with this in the hearing that she had. And she was just smirking and smiling and looking around at her friends. And it's like she can't believe she can get away with this absolute grift. This is this is rolling the taxpayer at this point. And obviously a bunch of men had to take pay cuts. A bunch of these women got a bunch of money that they weren't entitled to. And it's all coming at our expense. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
At the risk of sounding like an unreconstructed chauvinist pig, which no one's ever accused me of before. But there are definitely characteristics in women. They don't all have them, but they are quite often shared. There's sort of, I suppose, the bitch factor, the factor that cries rape when there hasn't been a rape, the sort of. Look, I watch my male children and my female children, and there are definite different characteristics. And I think that one of the problems about third wave feminism is that it has weaponized some of the worst characteristics in women, like the fact that they can laugh about the fact that they're getting one over on men. They're not really after justice. They're really after actually trying to...
It's power.
Grind. It's about power.
And they're very forthright about saying it. I mean, for example, the important thing, and again, the Conservatives don't know anything about this. So if you're a Conservative listening to this, right, never again use the phrase cultural Marxism. Never use it, right? The correct term that the left uses for what you're trying to describe is intersectionality. That's the word. So replace it in your lexicon. Cultural Marxism means intersectionalism. And then Google intersectionality or intersectionalism, and then just look in your local schools, in your universities. They're very intersectional, they're very inclusive, they're very diverse. This is what you're talking about. But as soon as you say cultural Marxism, they can parlay that into, oh, it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Even though literally, like, a Conservative will say, well, we're talking about the Frankfurt School with Herbert Marcuse, they fled over with Jacques Derrida and Foucault, and all of that's correct. All of that is, yes, that's exactly what happened. And that's where these ideas were first born. But the left has a habit of forming narratives. But they can't form an anti-intersectional narrative because that's the main thrust of their own argument. So you've got to weaponize that against them.
You see, it's interesting. I think I was mentioning to you earlier about how I used to describe myself as a kind of libertarian. And then I realized that there are actually some elements in my world view which weren't answered by libertarianism, and actually sometimes libertarianism is about stupid things like open borders, for example, which can completely... Liberty is nothing if it doesn't mean liberty for the people in any given country. If you're taking away the liberty to give it to somebody else, that's not really liberty, is it?
No.
And
at no point were any of these people consulted about opening the borders. That's the thing. It's not like Tony Blair didn't run on a platform of open borders for everyone, because the working class voters of the North would have gone, no.
No, he did it by stealth, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. It's all done.
Andrew Nether letter.
Absolutely. And the Conservatives never decided to change the situation, which is terrible. And it ended up with, I think this kind of thing fed into Brexit. This is why we're in this situation.
Totally. In fact, we'll go back onto open borders and stuff in a moment. But I just wanted to develop this point about a strand within conservatism that they ought to be talking about to do with gender pay gap, which is they're not. Which is that, of course, it's a good thing that there is a gender pay gap, because actually what it means is that you don't have this. Well, rather, you have less likelihood of this problem, which has now arisen in the West, which is that men earning less than women are not interested in having these men as their partners because they're useful. So people are not breeding, so the family is breaking down. Mm-hmm. These are things that conservatives should be getting on top of, rather than feeling embarrassed about.
Yeah, and the Conservatives should be hyper-aggressive about this. Because, I mean, if you think about it, like the left, the intersectional left are attacking the very foundations of civilization itself. Like, civilization is built on the family unit. It's built on a mother, a father who make children who are then concerned about their local communities, and the local communities are concerned about the wider sort of county that they're in, and then the counties are concerned about state control. You know, it all should flow from the bottom upwards, and it all starts with the family unit, and that starts with a man and a woman. And so the left have gone right for those most fundamental building blocks of society, and the Conservatives have nothing to say about it. It's disgraceful. Yeah. It's absolutely disgraceful. And it's honestly something that I think future generations of Conservatives are going to look back on the time period now, and there will be nothing good said about modern conservatism.
I think you're right. And do you think that it was planned, this multiple pronged assault on the very basis of civilization? For example, you've got not just attacks on the family as the source of all good, and notice how the left, when the Conservative Party used that phrase "family values," how roundly they were mocked and abused by the left for using that. So they're not just attacking the family, but they're also attacking the very concept of what is a man and what is a woman.
Oh yeah.
Was this planned or was this accidental?
So it's not accidental. It is by design, but I wouldn't say it was planned. Say it's planned implies some sort of overarching like conspirator or something like that,
Yeah.
that has some 40-year plan for the West or something. That's not how they view themselves. They view themselves in much more immediate circumstances. But the point is that the ideology itself is all about critiquing power. Now, this is something that most people are generally uncomfortable talking about, because power is a word that's got very negative connotations, and rightfully so. Obviously, some terrible things have been done using great power and very little responsibility. But if you look at anything from intersectionality, you can't even define the terms without factoring power dynamics into it. For example, they'll tell you that racism is power plus privilege and prejudice or something.
Yeah.
Power plus prejudice, sorry. And so if you can be prejudicial against a white person, but as far as they're concerned, black people don't have institutional power.
Right.
So therefore they cannot actually be racist. And that formula applies to sexism, ageism, transgenderism, all that sort of thing. This is the general logic of which the...
Did they write? Has this been codified in a book? Or is this-
Absolutely. Any social science text, you'll be able to find some formulation of this in universities.
And this is what every social sciences student is learning about.
Probably not every single one, but it's very widespread.
Yeah.
Very widespread. I mean, go into any diversity officer and ask them how they define racism.
Yeah.
And if they know their stuff, they'll say it's power plus prejudice.
Yeah.
But if they don't, they'll say, oh, it's about judging people based on their skin. And that's how you know you've got a useful idiot.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of catching up to do.
Yes, we do. And this is why a centre-left liberal is here to kick the Conservatives up the rear. For example, like you were saying, the Conservatives would say family values and they'd be laughed at by the left. Well, I think it's time for the Conservatives to start understanding that the left is dying. They're losing elections all over the place. They're currently... I mean, the amount of Vice magazine articles I've seen about people voluntarily sterilising themselves...
Yes.
Good. Maybe we should encourage leftists to voluntarily sterilise themselves, because I'm a father.
Well, they go one further. There's the VHment, voluntary extinction.
Oh, really? I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
But it's the inevitable conclusion if you
Yeah.
kind of hate humans.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it is definitely time for Conservatives to say, actually, we do stand for family values, and when you laugh at us, we're just going to smile and say, yes, but we are right and you're wrong, and history will bear that out.
That's what Jacob Rees-Mogg does.
Yes.
He's completely unembarrassed.
Oh, totally.
And he will repeat it.
Yeah. Don't look at these childless 30-something feminist women who are going to die and eventually be eaten by their own cats. They are not a model for how people should live. They don't know. They just know they hate their fathers. They hate the patriarchy. They hate everything
Yeah.
around them. The entire world was crafted by an evil god as far as they are concerned.
Yeah.
And they will do everything in their power to destroy it. Because at the end of the day, the left has managed to delegitimize all of Western civilization. I mean, the very concept of being anti-racist comes from English liberal tradition. If it wasn't for us, there would be no conception of what it is bad to be racist. Unfortunately for us, I suppose, we did agree that, and now the progressives have gone, right, well, we've decided that racism is the worst thing in the world. No, racism is not the worst thing in the world. It's not pleasant, but it's not the worst. There are many, many worse things than racism. It's the same way as the feminists going, oh, well, rape is the worst thing that can happen to a person. No, it's not. It's absolutely not. If rape was the worst thing that could happen to you, every rape victim would commit suicide.
Yes.
They don't. And so it's not. You know, it's bad, very bad, obviously, but it's this sense of scale that they've completely lost, and almost deliberately so. And so they've got to the point now where they've undermined all of the foundations of the civilization in which they were bred, and they are trying to break down every single barrier, as you see in things like drag kids now. And I mean, like any parent who wants their child to dress up in drag before they've even hit puberty, I mean, I've got very little positive to say about those people.
And yet it's celebrated in... Well, you've got...
In Vice magazine and in The Guardian.
In Vice
and,
magazine,
yes.
and on a sort of higher level than that, you've got Vanity Fair celebrating the courage of Caitlyn stroke Bruce Jenner.
Yeah.
And it's...
Well, the important thing... So this is the thing, right? The important thing for Conservatives to remember is where they can get a victory and where they can't, right? So you can't actually argue against transgenderism because you are defenders of liberty. And part of being at liberty is to say that I own my own body.
Yeah.
And if I own my own body, I can do what the damn hell I want with my body. And there is, an unimpeachable moral good for the liberal side, the sort of like the liberty side. However, a child is in absolutely no condition to make that kind of judgment. An adult, like Bruce Jenner or whatever, or Caitlyn Jenner, fine. And you guys should celebrate that. If an adult wants to do that, you say, great. You use your freedom exactly as you think is necessary to make you happy in your life. However, being a parent, you have a duty of care to a child who hasn't even hit puberty yet, and you are expecting them to start taking hormone blockers and chemically castrate themselves in order to fulfill a particularly progressive worldview. The fact that these people have a 40% suicide rate and a much higher rate of cancer, and like I said, they're sterilized, is not relevant to this ideology. And that's where the Conservatives have to go, wait, we are the party of family values, we are the defenders of children, and we will not let you do this.
Yes. Can I run a theory by you, which on the whole transgender thing, which is that I think we understand that if you incentivize particular kinds of behavior through the tax system or whatever, for example, if you enable single mothers to jump up the housing queue, then you will get more single mothers. In the same way, I wonder whether the rush of transgenderism is a response, even if only a subconscious response, by some men to the current feminist hegemony. So you've got this world in which women now in the West completely rule everything is going their way. What is your option as a man? Well, one of the few options you've got to gain power in this weird power pyramid is to join the ranks of the powerful gender.
Now, that's a very interesting way of framing it, because it's not only to gain power in the power pyramid, it's to leap to the very top. Because as far as they're concerned, transgender people are among the most oppressed people in all of the world.
It's the victimhood Olympics.
It is absolutely.
You get gold.
The totem pole of victimhood. And and you can, and if you're a person of colour, that's the way to achieve the very top of it, is to be a disabled, transgender, homosexual person of colour.
Yes.
That is the most oppressed person in all of society. And because you're so oppressed, you'll be invited everywhere, like Monroe Bergdorf. It doesn't matter how much you hate the white race and sit there and say the white race is the most evil force to have ever existed, which is something she said on a BBC clip that was, put around the internet by the BBC, using my money to tell me how much of an evil racist I am. She'll be considered oppressed while she does it, which is frankly quite amazing, in my opinion.
Tell me, do you think that we are, well, you particularly, because you've got about 100,000 times more listeners than I've got. Is the mainstream media just over, basically?
I think they're on a clock, and I think that, they are trying to adapt to the new reality. But it's the same.
Are they though? Are they?
Yeah, they are. They're trying to get video content on the internet, and they're trying to modernise.
Oh, but tell me. Here's what I'm seeing. I was a journalist in the glory days, and I was at the end of the Roman Republic. Yeah. I saw it before it all went tits up, before the barbarians got through the gates, and newspapers had values. They had the backbench, and they had the subs, and they had all these keepers of the wisdom of print media going back generations, and it was very respectable. Now I see these teenagers who want to be journalists, but they can't write.
Yep.
They all have a very heavy social justice warrior agenda to promote, and the newspapers are run by editors who are conscious of the fact that they're losing circulation. But their solution to the losing circulation is to make themselves more like the stuff that people can get for free on the internet, thus defeating the object of being a print newspaper, which should provide value added that the internet can't provide, like sort of rigor, professionalism. So, for example, what I see a lot in newspapers now is X is this celebrity or politician is criticised on Twitter for having said something, and you examine it and you're looking about 2 or 3 Twitter activists. Well, that's not a legitimate story.
No.
And yet this is where the papers are going.
Yes, but do you know why?
Tell me.
It's terribly convenient. They don't even have to get out of their chairs.
Yeah, that's true.
It's very easy. And I mean, there is an entire industry in the press now that is effectively just monitoring Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
Yes.
And every day, Donald Trump will tweet something incendiary, and then a dozen articles will be written by 24 journalists who are quote unquote journalists who are very proud of their scoop on Donald Trump's
But
latest
to be
tweets.
fair, Donald Trump is the president of the USA, and his tweets are really,
true.
really good.
That's true.
I'm always happy. They just brighten up my life when I read a Donald Trump.
Same here, especially when he's sassing them. But the point is, this is not a healthy and conducive environment to honestly what I would consider to be proper journalism. It's lazy and it's easy, and they don't bother, and it's very easy to get trapped in these kind of ideological channels and be entirely adversarial and give no charity to the other side.
It's interesting that two of the things that have real traction on the internet are long form journalism, like you get at Quiet, and long form discussions like the ones that you do, which shows that there is an appetite out there, not for stupid, but for clever.
There is, absolutely. I mean, QI was a great example. Yeah. QI was a smash hit, and nobody expected it to be because, I mean, you know, it sounds like stuffy, pretentious middle-class nonsense, but it turned out to be wildly entertaining. And, you know, they had the right host, you know, and it shows that people aren't actually as far gone as they might think.
Who are these people that listen to your or watch your shows?
Well, I mean, they're an average age of 30 on my channel.
How do you know this stuff?
I've got analytics,
okay,
which I can see with a good spread between around 24 to 30, and then 30 to 44. I think is the rough spread of like the bell curve on mine, with it 30 being the center. And I suppose they're people who have seen much in the same way that I've seen in real life, and are glad that someone's talking about it and telling them about this aspect of reality that otherwise tends to go unmentioned in the mainstream.
Isn't that, after all, the essence of free markets, that
Yes.
you work out something that is not being currently provided, that people want, and you give it to them?
It wasn't even deliberate, to be honest. I only ever started doing this because at the time I was unemployed. And I was just frustrated, frankly. I was like, there'd be times where I'd see something, you know, something that was just like, well, that is so unbelievably illiberal. I mean, I can't believe even the Labour Party would suggest something like that. And I'd just be laying in bed thinking, should I be doing something? You know, I guess I felt kind of helpless because I was just laying there and I was frustrated. And there were some nights where I'd be unable to get to sleep, thinking, do I have a duty to be at least in some way active in regards to this, or do I just silently carry on with my life and just ignore what I've seen and assume that everything will work itself out? And I'm glad I did start speaking about this sort of thing, because the more I've learned is there is absolutely no hope of this fixing itself, because the way that Western society is being attacked is unbelievably clever, and the people who have developed this, undoubted geniuses, everyone. You know,
who are you talking about?
The people like Marcuse, people like Foucault and Derrida, people who have taken, I mean, what would be sloppily called postmodernism, but I think is more accurately called post-structuralism, although I'm not an expert on this, and have decided to use these kind of techniques to invalidate almost everything.
Logic, facts.
Well, absolutely. I mean, these people, they start with the premise that all of reality is constructed via words, and which is true. All of our, perceived realities is constructed by words. And these are in fact a prison. Words only ever interface with other words. So you can never escape this prison. And then you realize that, then you take into account that language is obviously inherently subjective. People interpret from different statements different things. And then you realize that, in fact, all of our perceptions are inherently subjective. For example, we can presume we're both seeing the same colours and hearing the same noises, but to each other we don't actually know what they sound like. And so we find ourselves in some kind of Cartesian bind where we're not really sure if what we are perceiving is reality or if we're plugged into a matrix or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the bumbling British empiricist has to come along and say, well, we're just going to have to assume that we are, because we don't actually have the evolutionary tools to be able to ever break this bind. So we've thought ourselves into a position where we can't be sure. But the postmodernists can say, well, effectively what this means is that everything is a subjective judgment, a value judgment of a sort. So you can say that I believe that's empirically better, but I can undermine your very notion of empiricism by pointing out the subjective flaws of your own perceptions and your own mental processes. And think of, your own senses deceive you from time to time. And this all is, it puts the person that they're attacking with this line of logic into a kind of fog, into a kind of haze.
Yes.
And you see, the quickest thing is them saying, well, what are British values? And you suddenly, oh God, I don't know. But you know it when you see it. And so now you have to think, oh God, how do I categorize British values? And for anyone listening, the quickest way to pin it down, and you just say it and be firm on it, is all of English political thought is about accountability of power. That's it. All of it. From the very first sort of Anglo-Saxon electoral kings, right through the Middle Ages to, I can't remember who it was, but it's sometime in the 14th century. I read The Rule of Law by Tom Bingley, I think it was. And
Bingham.
Bingham, sorry, yeah. And he pointed out that in the 14th century that, it was commonly said that though the wind would, paraphrasing obviously, the wind would enter the most rickety shack in all of England, but the king couldn't. And that is just, isn't that just a beautiful statement in itself? It's about accountability. It's about the importance and sovereignty of the individual. And that is all of English political thought has always been about accountability. And I mean, there are modern studies that say, oh, well, the English language is it's very quick to place blame. And it's like, well, of course it is, because that's the person that you hold accountable. Whose fault? Why did this happen? We need you, and that accountability keeps people honest and it keeps them responsible. And so if you want, what's a British value? Accountability. That's the first thing you should go for, and it's unimpeachable. They can't attack that. You can't say, well, I don't want someone in power who's unaccountable or who is accountable. I want them to be unaccountable. They're never going to say that. And so you've won that argument right away. And now you've got a firm footing. British values are about accountability. Now what? Fairness, tolerance, acceptance, whatever you want to build on top of that. But you've got a root, and then they can't attack it. And that's what you have to do. You just cut through the fog and find something solid that even if they say, well, I don't think that you can be sure, I'm like, well, that's your opinion, but I'm sure of this, and I don't care if you don't think I'm sure. You find something that's solid that you can hold on to, and then you move from there.
I think that this yearning for personal meaning, and B, for counters to the current narrative explains, for example, the huge success of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life.
Absolutely.
These young men, particularly young men, who've been told that they're basically rapists,
and racists,
and racist. That their culture has no value.
Well, they're inherently oppressive.
Yeah, and they're looking. And where do they don't learn this? They don't get a counter to this in the universities.
Yep.
They don't even get it in schools. Increasingly, I mean, even in private schools. Mm-hmm. One of my mini gripes. I'm sure you haven't got children that you're trying to put through private school, have you?
Not yet.
No.
My son's too young for school.
Okay, but actually, it's really depressing seeing how pretty much every private school now has a kind of super head who wants to make the school more modern and relevant and do exactly what the parents don't really want the school to do, because actually they want tradition, they want values.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you're saying about meaning is very important, because this is something that you see amongst millennials, again, who get themselves sterilized every 5 minutes. They are desperately searching for meaning, and it's so bizarre to watch it, because that meaning comes from your children, right? I mean, the purpose of a human being is to reproduce, and continue the species. And so once you realize that is like the biological imperative of a human being, then you realize why meaning starts to come from children. Because as soon as you're for any millennials who are afraid of children, they're really easy. They kind of raise themselves in many ways. Yes. You just have to be an emotional stability for them. And for you, unbelievable amounts of meaning. Suddenly your life has a purpose. You have a goal. You have responsibility, and you have reason. The millennials at the moment who are busy debasing themselves by doing whatever it is they want and getting themselves sterilized, these people are too afraid to take on any responsibility and will never find any meaning because of it. People
often point out that you look at the leaders of the West at the moment, not Trump, childless.
20 years ago it would have been unthinkable.
It's a big deal, isn't it?
unthinkable.
The left is very good at talking about, and we're talking about the regressive SJW left, is very good at talking about future generations and think of the children and brandishing children as a kind of their tool to advance their argument. But actually, they don't believe in the children or the future.
Not at least not British children. I mean, they seem to treat like other countries and people from the third world as children. They seem to have exported that kind of parental instinct into these other adults from other civilizations, and I find that very strange, but it's a long thing to get into.
Well, it's a projection of that, but it's like Mrs. Jellyby in Dickens constantly trying to save people from foreign countries and ignoring that's the common well, I think the fact that you exist and that you're so popular does give me a bit of hope, because I don't think we're going to... I was watching Owen Jones the other night, and he's very effective at he's always on the attack. He's very good with sound bites, and the left is very good at sound bites.
Yes.
And I think sometimes these can't be countered by sound bites. They have to be deconstructed with long arguments like your...
Yeah.
I mean, you've taken, 10, 15 minutes this week to talk about Anna Soubry and the Nazis.
I think it was about 20 or something. 20,
was it?
20
yeah.
30 minutes.
But it needed that. It needed... Anna Soubry has to do is go on TV and say, they called me a Nazi and it is the worst thing in the world and it means that we must censor the far right.
Yeah.
That's her argument made.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Everyone jumps on the bandwagon, from Theresa May to Owen Jones to Corbyn and so on.
It's amazing, isn't it? There's a complete consensus. It's like, it's unacceptable for people to call Anna Soubry a Nazi. It's like, well, I'm sorry. There are lots of clips of Anna Soubry calling other people Nazis and fascists. Yeah. I'm sorry. This is the height of hypocrisy. And do tell me about the suffering that you've had after being called a Nazi. That's never happened to me before.
Yeah.
Go on, explain to me exactly what that's like. You bloody hypocrites.
Yeah. That's it. And there's no... the sad thing is, I don't think there's any magic formula that we can find, which is going to... But we can use cheats.
Well, honestly, the magic formula is establishing your own moral framework and then being certain of it. Why what you think is moral. The reason that like Mogg and Pete Hitchens are becoming kind of superstars of the British right at the moment is because they have a moral base. Now, I mean, I might not even agree necessarily on every point of their moral base, but I am just so relieved to see some kind of moral fortitude coming out of the Conservatives for once that isn't left-wing morality. Because left-wing morality is, in my opinion, basically an inversion of morality. It's all an appeal to power. And like the idea that weakness is virtue is the curse of the left. And the first thing that they'll do is say, well, are you saying strength is a virtue? It's like, no, I'm saying right action is a virtue. That's the only way virtue is derived. It's not from weakness. It's not from strength. It's from being good, actually being virtuous. And then you say, oh, what does that mean? Exactly. Now we have to have a long, detailed conversation.
Now we can talk.
Exactly. Exactly. Now we have a conversation about that. But we don't just say, oh, that person's weak, therefore they are decent.
Before we go, and I think we should soon, but I have got to ask you, what do you think about... You must feel as I do that Silicon Valley censorship of conservative voices particularly, but free speech generally, is one of the greatest problems of our age. Do you think that this can be solved by somebody like Peter Thiel coming along and setting up a new... Or do you think trust busting is the answer?
I mean, in the immediate future, I would say trust busting is the best option. And it's very frustrating. So I'm going to sneeze. Sorry about that.
That's God punishing you for being not left-wing enough.
And an atheist.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the immediate future, I do think antitrust laws could be used to break up what is obviously a cartel in Silicon Valley. They're open about the fact that they'll talk to each other, they'll share the same values, and when Tim Cook is preaching sin and not sin from a pulpit in Silicon Valley, it's hard not to view them as some kind of woke entity. Honestly, very much like fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentili would say. And this is why I'm not a fascist, obviously. In fact, I'm an anti-fascist in many ways. But like, you've got to be able to understand where they're coming from, and you've got to read their material to understand why they thought what they did. And one of the things that I found very interesting about fascism is the way that Gentili, he characterized it as an ethical state. Now, we usually use the term ethical in lay terms to say that's a good thing to do, that's a moral thing to do. But that's not what he means. What he means is an entity with an ethical framework, as in the entity itself, more than an individual, the structure itself has an ethical framework that it determines right from wrong from, and then has a moral goal in mind. So it starts from its position and then is trying to achieve something. Whereas like the liberal state doesn't do that. Like this is the whole point of the small government conservatives is then to say the state itself derives its legitimacy from protecting your rights. And so it can't tell you how to think. It can't tell you how to be. All it can say is, these are certain conditions that the state will guarantee. And from that point onwards, we can have a talk about anything else, right? But that's the way the liberal state derives its legitimacy. And the difference between that and the fascist and socialist states, the fascist and socialists said no. The socialists say we should all be equal. The fascists say we should all be in service of the one true state and all of this. But they have a distinct different ethical goal. And so when Gentili says the fascist state is wide awake and has a will of its own, what he means is it's an entity that's going to try and alter the world to suit its sensibilities. It doesn't care about the individual. It doesn't care about, and that's the same thing that Tim Cook is doing in Silicon Valley right now. It's an ethical, wide-awake organization, and it knows what it wants.
I think on that sinister note, we should end the podcast. You were listening to the Delling Pod, I think we're going to call it. Is that a good? Do you like Delling Pod?
I think it's very good.
Okay, Delling Pod with Carl Benjamin, and wasn't it wonderful? Wasn't it fantastic having him on Sargon of Akkad? I'm so pleased. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.